April 8, 1943. High above the skies of Nazi-occupied France, at 27,000 feet, a moment of quiet confidence settled in the cockpit of Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken, the Luftwaffe ace, flying his Focke-Wulf 195, scanned the blue expanse below through the glass canopy. What he saw made him grin. Silhouetted against the spring haze, 16 massive American fighters were heaving themselves upward with what seemed like painful effort. Hermeken keyed his radio and laughed. "They've sent flying milk bottles," he told his wingman, a note of amused contempt in his voice. The American aircraft were unlike anything the Germans had seen. Fat, slow, and awkward. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, making their combat debut. To the Luftwaffe, veterans of campaigns from Poland to the Eastern Front, these strange, oversized aircraft were absurd. Their hulking fuselages looked more like barrels than war machines. Their wings appeared too small for their bulk, their propellers far larger than anything in the German arsenal. To experienced German pilots, used to dancing through the skies in sleek Messerschmitts and Spitfires, the Thunderbolt looked like a joke. And so they laughed. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the same aircraft they were mocking would soon become the instrument of their own destruction. In less than 2 years, those flying milk bottles would be transformed into the most feared warplanes in Europe. With their 8 heavy machine guns, their brute force durability, and their unmatched speed in a dive, the P-47 Thunderbolt would write a new chapter in aerial warfare. German pilots who had once mocked their shape would later dread their sound. And when the tide turned in the air war over Europe, it would be Thunderbolts that brought the thunder. The story of the P-47 begins in desperation. In 1940, as German forces swept across France and bombers pounded British cities, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a frantic specification. They needed a high-altitude interceptor, fast, capable of countering German aircraft at the edge of space. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with a flair for the unconventional, looked at the challenge and said something prophetic. "It will be a dinosaur," he warned, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." What he and his team designed was not a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a force of nature. The prototype XP-47B was unlike anything that had flown before. When it took to the air for the first time in May 1941, observers were stunned. It was massive, almost 10,000 pounds empty, more than many twin-engine aircraft. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that delivered 2,000 horsepower. It had a turbosupercharger the size of a small car. The entire rear fuselage was taken up with ducting and piping. Its appearance led many to ask the same question. This thing actually flies? Not only did it fly, it soared. At altitude, it was peerless. The turbosupercharger, fed by hot exhaust gases, allowed the engine to maintain full sea-level power above 25,000 feet. Where German fighters struggled for oxygen, the Thunderbolt powered forward like a train on rails. Pilots quickly learned that it didn't fly like a feather. It flew like a hammer. You didn't dance with it, you aimed it. But early on, the P-47's learning curve was steep and often fatal. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training. The Thunderbolt had a nasty tendency to ground loop on landing. Its immense power made it torque violently on takeoff, and its love of diving meant it frequently entered compressibility, where control surfaces froze due to shock waves at high speed. It was a dangerous aircraft to master, and some never lived long enough to do so. When the first P-47s entered combat over Europe in the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe was not impressed. German pilots quickly learned that the Thunderbolt couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf, couldn't climb like a Messerschmitt, and struggled in tight dogfights. Some began calling it Der Fliegende Backstein, the flying brick. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected commanders, wrote that the new American fighter flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. It was, he believed, meat for the slaughter. And indeed, in their first month of operations, American units lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed kills. British observers, flying alongside them in sleek Spitfires, quietly suggested the Americans reconsider their choice of fighter. Pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to jump out and run around the cockpit. But in those early encounters, the Germans missed something critical. Yes, the Thunderbolt was clumsy. Yes, it handled poorly in turning fights. But it could take punishment like no aircraft they had ever encountered. Again and again, P-47s returned from missions riddled with holes, their engines smoking, their pilots wounded but still flying. One aircraft came home with over 120 hits, including cannon strikes that would have exploded lesser aircraft. And when the Thunderbolts hit back, the results were devastating. With 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each carrying 425 rounds, the P-47 delivered more sustained firepower than anything in the skies. At 300 yards, its bullets converged in a 6-foot-wide zone of destruction. It wasn't just about accuracy, it was about probability. The Thunderbolt didn't need one perfect shot. It needed one solid burst. And that burst could cut a fighter in half. The moment everything began to change came on June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was flying a return escort mission when his formation was ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s. Johnson's P-47 was hit immediately. 20mm cannon shells shattered his canopy, punctured his fuel lines, and wounded him in the face and leg. The engine was on fire. He tried to bail out, but a shell had jammed the canopy shut. He was trapped. And still, he flew. Barely able to see through the oil-smeared windscreen, controls sluggish, his aircraft riddled with holes, Johnson turned toward England. But before he could escape, a lone German pilot appeared and attacked. Johnson couldn't evade. He simply braced behind his armor plate. The German fired all his remaining cannon shells, then all his machine gun ammunition. The Thunderbolt refused to die. Finally, the German pilot pulled alongside, gave a salute, and flew away out of ammunition. Johnson landed his aircraft. The crew chief counted over 200 bullet holes before stopping. One shell had missed his head by inches, and yet the P-47 had brought him home. After that mission, perceptions began to shift. American pilots adapted. They realized the P-47 was not a dogfighter, it was a juggernaut. It didn't win by turning tighter. It won by diving faster, hitting harder, and surviving longer. They called it the boom and zoom tactic. Climb to 30,000 feet. Wait. When enemy fighters appeared below, roll inverted, dive like a meteor, unleash a storm of .50 cal fire, and climb away before the enemy could react. Thunderbolt formations became flying executioners. They didn't dogfight, they ambushed, and they annihilated. German pilots were caught off guard. Their planes couldn't match the P-47 in a dive. They couldn't absorb its fire. And worst of all, they couldn't get away. Then came the D-22 variant with paddle blade propellers. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt could climb nearly 3,000 feet per minute, could accelerate faster, could carry more fuel and more bombs. The unique sound of its massive blades, thunderous, terrifying, became known across Europe. German troops and pilots alike recognized it. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. It meant one thing: death was coming from above. By early 1944, Thunderbolts escorted bombers deep into Germany. And when Luftwaffe fighters tried to intercept them, they met a wall of .50 caliber fire. On March 6, 1944, German ace Gunther Rall encountered Thunderbolts at high altitude. His formation was torn apart. In less than 30 seconds, 3 German fighters were gone. No warning, no escape, just thunder. When P-51 Mustangs began to take over long-range escort duties, the P-47 found a new role: ground attack. And it was devastating. With 2 1,000-pound bombs and 10 5-inch rockets, the Thunderbolt became a flying artillery platform. German tanks, trucks, trains, and gun positions were no match. One Wehrmacht officer, watching a column of trucks obliterated by a single pass, said, "They weren't fighter bombers. They were flying artillery." On D-Day, over 500 Thunderbolts flew air cover. German aircraft that tried to reach the beaches were shot down before they got close. One pilot from JG-2, one of only 3 to return, said, "We tried to break through, 12 of us. I was the only one who came back. The sky belonged to the Americans." Behind this battlefield dominance stood something even more powerful than the aircraft: American industry. Republic Aviation built over 15,600 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. At peak, the factory produced one every hour. Ammunition factories produced over 10 million .50 caliber rounds per month. Pilots received over 400 hours of training before entering combat, 4 times what German pilots had by 1945. Even the Me-262 jet fighter, with its 540 miles per hour top speed, couldn't escape. P-47s caught jets during takeoff in dives, or when they slowed to attack bombers. And when they caught them, 8 heavy machine guns ended the story in seconds. The final insult came during Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's last desperate attack on Allied airfields on January 1, 1945. At one airfield, 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed on the ground. Within 48 hours, replacements arrived. A captured German pilot, boasting about the attack, was told, "We'll have 40 new ones tomorrow. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" He had no answer. By war's end, the numbers told the story. Over 3,700 German aircraft destroyed in the air. Over 3,300 on the ground. Tens of thousands of vehicles. Thousands of locomotives and rail cars. Entire divisions reduced to ashes. But perhaps the final word belongs to Oberst Joseph Priller, the same man who once called the P-47 a pregnant cow. In March 1945, he was interviewed for a morale film that was never released. What he said was deemed too demoralizing. "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unmatched. Its pilots better trained. Its numbers overwhelming. We laughed in 1943. We're not laughing now. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win because it was pretty. It didn't win because it was elegant. It won because it was American, designed for mass production, for survivability, for firepower, and for victory." From object of ridicule to instrument of annihilation, the Thunderbolt buried the Luftwaffe in steel, smoke, and thunder. When it came fast, came heavy, and it came to win.